when Bill was talking to us about his first place at the Wixoss Ceremony, using his Madoka deck list, we also discussed about an other card theory called flow, and I thought this one deserved its own video for you guys. So here it is, separated out from that video, just to talk more in depth about this card theory, how flow can help you sort of ruin your opponent's momentum or tempo while strengthening your own. Just something that if you know what your own deck's flow is, you probably have a better grasp on what you should be doing and where you're strong and where you're weak in this game in terms of resources. I'll let Bill take it over because he does a great job explaining it.
And if you're game for it, I wanted to talk some about like my thoughts on Wixoss overall as a game. Speaking of the comparisons.
Well, it's we're not really a channel that talks about competitive strategy or deck theory whatsoever. So
yeah, it's almost like talking about Waycross is what we do.
Yeah, I'm game.
I would love to.
You said it earlier. You were talking about a flow.
Yeah. So here's the thing: a lot of other card games have multiple resource pools that you've got to worry about. Magic has a life total. It has mana that is not on the cards. Hearthstone has mana and life total that are separate, like things. Waycross doesn't have that, at least currently. There may be, I know future sets will like coins or whatever, but currently all your resources are cards, and cards are all your resources. And at least with the current effect, they're like matter and energy in the universe. They're never created or destroyed. Mm-hmm. Your main deck cards never leave the game, currently, and there is no zone they cannot move into or move out of.
I really like that. I actually really love that thought process.
The Elrig deck's a bit different, but it's more like, I think the Elrig deck should be viewed less as cards and more like a set of once per game abilities. Like, if I put it in my Dungeons & Dragons terms, the Elrig deck is like picking your race and your class. It's the core of everything you'll do, and you just take it for granted that this is what I'm doing.
Yes, that's a really good way of looking at it as well. Yeah. Your center Elrig is always going to be the backbone of your deck, no matter what dream team you make.
But so, because cards aren't leaving the game, it's not so much like even though we say things like we're spending Enter or something, we're not spending them and they're gone from the game and I can never have those cards in the Enter zone again.
Yeah.
They're moving from A to trash. They're just flowing between the different zones that are on the field. There's nothing out there that isn't represented by a card, except for the last damage that loses you the game.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else has a card. There's no counters. There's freeze tokens and stuff, but it's all effects that hit a card, right?
Right. There's
states. No creating a phantom card over here or create a 1/1 blank card.
Right.
Yet anyway. So I think about the flow between the zones, and typically there is what I think about the natural flow. Most cards, the typical natural flow of cards, is from the deck to your hand, to the field of Signy, to the Enter zone, to the trash.
Mm-hmm.
If you're playing me, back into the deck. Because there's going to be a refresh.
Yes.
So
true.
I think it's really useful to think about, how does my deck flow? Where all of those are connected? Where is it strong? Where am I weak? How does that cause the adjacent steps to be strong or weak? How do weird cards interact with that? Like if a card short circuit and sends a card from the field to trash, for example, when it vanishes, then okay, I'm missing Enter from that flow that I would have normally expected to have. And how do you interact with your opponent's flow? What part of their flow are you attacking? And how does that affect what they're going to be able to do? Examples for other decks. No Limit is clearly attacking the field. Like, they want a clear field. But also, some versions of No Limit, like what you guys run and what Joseph runs, are also like testing weak spots. You've got a little bit of discard. Not enough to call it a discard deck or to ruin the hand of somebody like me that's drawing a bunch, but if the opponent's flow is weak on hand draw, you're going to give them a bad time. If you run go to the top, you're testing their enter. If they happen to be weak on enter, that's going to cause them a bad time. This deck in particular, now having said that, I'm going to say something that doesn't seem initially clear, but was clear to me once I tested a bit. This deck, this Madoka discard mid-range deck, attacks the hand.
Yep.
Therefore, it cannot enter starve.
Mm.
And that seems weird, but first of all, Lancer is anti-enter starve. I can't enter starve and Lancer because I have to vanish it in battle, which means it's vanishing, which means it's going to enter zone to do my Lancer. Hijikata is also have to vanish.
Mm-hmm.
But more than that, if I'm attacking your hand, there's 3 ways I could attack your hand. One would be thinking about it as the flow. One would be to prevent cards from going into it, and I don't think there's any effect in the game that does that right now, that like stops a draw. Other than
the most that you can do
out with refresh time.
Yep, you got it.
And I can't control that very well because I don't have I can mill in multiples of 5. I can't mill 2 to get the refresh timing exactly right on my opponent. I can attack hand directly and remove cards from it, which this deck does quite well. The other thing I can do to further that game plan is to attack the zone after it. If I vanish Signy, that's a lane you've got to go fill with cards from your hand.
Yep.
Yes.
Which you don't need.
I can 100% back you up on that because as an Uchu player, there's a point where I have now wrecked their hand, and I have to now actively destroy their lanes, or else they'll just redraw their hand, and I can't enter starve them at that point. That's the point when I keep saying in the podcast where at some point you need to go, okay, I'm no longer the control, I'm putting on the acceleration.
So at least the way I've been playing this deck, that point is from the start, especially against things like No Limit. Because we'll get into it, I'm excited to sort of walk through turn by turn the plan that I approach a game with this deck. But like turn 2, you want to be doing Hijikata. Turn 1 or 2, you want to be doing Lancer. You can't start the enter starve. You can't enter starve those early turns, and for the reasons you just said, you definitely don't want to do it late. So every card that I'm basically creating a vacuum on the field to suck cards out of their hand to destroy hand. This does mean I'm enter flooding them a bit, which isn't always a bad thing. Currently, most decks in the meta right now don't run a lot of effects that they haven't planned how to pay for. If they've got effects on a card, they want to use them. Otherwise, that card could be doing something better, which means they want a way to pay for them. And they're not planning for me to force them to stick everything I possibly can into the enter zone. So tons of my opponents lost the game with 5, 6, 7 cards in enter because they had nothing to do with it.
Right. So what you're saying is no one's really playing, the Magic equivalent term would be mana sinks. No one's really playing enter sinks in the fact that they are like, hey, this card says pay green and then do an effect, right? Everyone's doing like a one-time effect that is powerful because they think that's it. This enter ability is all that I'm going to get out of this card. They're not thinking, oh, actually, I'm going to have an overflow of enter, so I should use it liberally with this card.
Yeah, and if they have an effect they want to spend a lot of enter on, they've already built ways into their deck to get it. Because otherwise, if they run up against somebody who is enter starving them, they're going to get wrecked. Now, if the meta changes, I didn't run into things like Nightmare Step or something. What is it? That's 6. Yeah. If some people start running stuff like that, this strategy will turn bad. What else? So I loved to see Deafening Inferno played against me. Because
why is that?
So thinking about that flow again, the natural flow is hand to Signy to enter zone. If you play Deafening Inferno, you have taken a card from your hand and you've skipped the Signy zone. It's going straight to trash. So if I'm counting cards you drew versus lanes you can fill this game, after I discard you, that's a lane you can't fill later.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that because it makes me feel valid every single time I look at the Deafening Inferno and I go, this would be cool, but I'm going to enter charge it because I'd rather have a Signy in my hand.
Lancelot's great against when it can find a target on this deck. I mean, because Lancelot's a good card in general, but also you're lane filling and doing your removal. You're doing everything with one card from hand. And some enter, which I was going to give you anyway. So if it's got a target, it's great. I also don't always mind seeing my opponent guard. Because that's another one where you just took a card from your hand, which I'm trying to attack, and you skipped all the zones with it. It didn't get you didn't get advantage from it at every point of the flow. That's if I can destroy your hand, I'm gonna get that damage. It's just gonna be through an open lane later, and you won't get the enter for it.
Yeah, that does make sense as to sometimes you might want to play a guard as a Signy in order to lane fill. It still does the job of saving one of your life cloth, but it also gives you an enter for it.
Yeah, and it especially if you have cards that might have a life burst that say like grab something from your trash or be able to get something back from your trash.
It is better to have that in the
grave
yeah.
Entering your guard by either having it on the field or by some other means, I'm not sure. Like maybe you were enter charging extra and it happened to be there.
Discarded.
Yeah, discarded, whatever. Not a bad place to be.
Yeah, I had several servants hit the field. At one point, one of my opponents had 2 servants on the field against me because it's what they had. And I think that was probably the correct play. He didn't win because he was too far gone by that point. But, given where he was, it was likely the correct play. So that's how I'm interacting with my opponent's flow.
So, in a nutshell, what we discussed was this idea that flow is a way to hamper resources or strengthen your own resources, and knowing where you're strong or weak in it can help you. As the graphic shows you on the screen here, it goes from that you start with something in your deck, it goes to your hand, it then goes to the Signy field, then goes to the enter field, and eventually goes in the trash. And you could even say that it returns back to the deck if you end up with a refresh, which some decks in like the All-Star format, for example, loop themselves a lot, so they're renewable resources. And understanding where you're strong in your flow and where you're weak in your flow can also help you understand what you need to avoid from your opponents. For example, if you are pretty enter heavy and that you require a lot of enter, getting struck by a lot of trashing effects or discard effects can really hamper it, and then you'll have to know how to sort of adapt your flow in order to make up for this type of thing, which means that you're going to have to try to do more enter charging than usual, that you might end up having an open lane so that way you can actually get hit in order to pay for certain enter costs. That's just an example, maybe not a great one, but an example of something that you could do to try to adapt for that situation. And you might want to think, all right, well, what if my flow is really important from the trash that goes from the trash to my hand because I'm a reusable resource deck? Well, then you need to know that you need to strengthen your flow and go and put more things into the trash. So it's just a kind of cool concept to just sort of run your own decks through and see how you can best use the flow that's being introduced to you, especially for flow of a metagame. For example, if you're in an aggro metagame like we are currently in the no limit metagame, then you know that you're going to get quite a bit of enter, and it might be important to know how to use that enter. If we end up in more of a control metagame later down the line, you might be enter starved, and you might need to know how to best add to that resource that is enter, because you're going to get a lot of cards in hand as you end up with more of an overflow of stuff that just won't get used. So yeah, use this concept that Bill has sort of pioneered in your own decks and think about the flow of your own game.